The life of a thief in medieval Europe was rarely a matter of choice, and almost never a matter of glamour. To wake up in a drafty corner of a town, or perhaps in the lee of a haystack still damp with the previous night's frost, was to wake up with a stomach that had long since forgotten the sensation of being full. There were no plans made on such mornings, no schemes whispered in the dark. There was only the immediate, gnawing problem of survival, a problem that presented itself anew with every gray dawn. The air in the narrow streets would be thick with the smoke from 100 cooking fires, the smell of burning wood and cheap tallow mingling with the underlying, ever-present scent of mud and waste. It was a world where the line between living and merely enduring was as thin and sharp as a well-honed blade. The decision to take something that was not yours was seldom a decision at all. It was a slow, grinding acceptance of necessity, a final step taken after all other paths had crumbled into the mud. There was no romance in it, no rebellion. A young man with no trade, no land, and no family to fall back on might watch a baker haul his first loaves from the oven, the smell of fresh bread cutting through the morning's chill like a physical blow to the stomach. The baker, red-faced and sweating, would wipe his hands on his apron and turn his back for a single moment. In that moment, the distance between a man and a loaf of bread could shrink to nothing. The act itself was quick, fumbled, the bread hidden beneath a worn tunic, the heart hammering against the ribs not with excitement, but with a cold, pure terror that tasted like metal on the tongue. The consequences of such a moment were not quick. They stretched out, invisible but permanent. A stolen apple from a cart that had wobbled on a cobblestone, a chicken that had wandered into the wrong yard and was suddenly clutched against a chest. These were not just acts but transformations. In the eyes of the community, a person who performed such acts became marked. It was not a legal mark, not at first, but a social one. A shift in the way neighbors' eyes lingered a moment too long. A change in the tone of greetings at the well. The village or the town was a small, tightly woven place, and its memory for transgressions was long and unforgiving. A single slip and a person became that kind of person. A label that clung like the mud on a hemline, impossible to fully wash away. And so the thief existed in a strange, liminal space, neither fully part of the community he skirted, nor entirely free of its judgment. His work was done in the long, slow hours after midnight, when the moon had set and the only light came from a sliver of stars between the eaves of houses. He learned the texture of the night, the way the darkness pooled in corners and alleys, the sounds of a sleeping town, the creak of a settling beam, the distant bark of a dog that might mean nothing or everything, the soft hoot of an owl from the church tower. These became his clock and his warning system. He moved not with the fluid grace of a dancer, but with the slow, deliberate caution of a man walking on ice, each step placed with care, his breath held and released in silent, measured intervals. The problem, the great and defining irony of his profession, was that the people he sought to steal from had almost nothing worth taking. The homes of the poor, which were the only homes a thief could reasonably approach, were structures of desperation. Their walls were wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung that crumbled in the damp. Their roofs were thatch, home to as many insects and small creatures as the people below. Inside, a single room served for all of life. A hearth with a few smoldering embers, a rough-hewn table, a stool or two, and a pile of straw in the corner that served as a bed for the entire family. The possessions of such a household could be listed in a single breath. A metal pot, a wooden bowl, a spoon carved from horn. There were no coins, no jewels, no stores of fine cloth. The prize, after hours of waiting and shivering in an alley, might be a heel of stale bread or a half-empty sack of dried peas. The wealthy, of course, had things worth taking. But the wealthy did not live in houses of mud and thatch. They lived in stone houses or in fortified manors, surrounded by walls, gates, and, most importantly, by people. Guards who walked the walls, servants who slept in the hall, and the Lord himself, who might sleep with a sword within arm's reach. To approach such a place was to invite disaster. The stone walls held no shadows deep enough to hide in. The guards, even if they dozed, did so lightly, their dreams filled with the sounds of imagined intruders. And the dogs, the ever-present dogs, were not the pampered pets of a later age. They were large, half-wild animals, bred for aggression, whose loyalty was to the territory they guarded, and whose first response to any unfamiliar scent or sound was a deep, guttural bark that could wake the entire household. A man could spend his whole life in petty theft, stealing turnips and eggs, and never once glimpse the inside of a noble's treasury. It existed on a different plane, as inaccessible as the moon. The clergy presented another kind of target, one laden with its own peculiar dangers. A church might hold a chalice of silver, a crucifix of gold, or a few coins left as offerings. But a church was also a place watched over by a different kind of guardian. The priest or the monks were often as poor as the peasants they served, but they possessed something more formidable than guards. They possessed the community's belief. To steal from the church was not merely to steal from a building. It was to steal from God, or so the people believed. And the people, when they heard of such a theft, would not respond with mere anger. They would respond with a cold, righteous fury that was far more dangerous than the hot rage of a cheated merchant. A man could outrun a merchant. He could not outrun an entire village that believed his soul was forfeit. There were tales, of course, whispered in the dim corners of taverns, of great robberies, of men who tunneled into crypts and emerged with jeweled reliquaries, of highwaymen who stopped rich merchants on the road and stripped them of their gold. But these were stories, entertainment for those who would never dare such things. The reality for the common thief was far more mundane and far more bleak. It was the slow, patient observation of a market stall, waiting for the owner to be distracted. It was the desperate, fumbling search through a traveler's pack while he slept in a stable. It was the cold, creeping dread of being recognized, of hearing your name shouted in the street, of feeling a heavy hand fall on your shoulder. When a thief was caught, and most were, eventually there was no formal trial in the modern sense. There was only the moment of capture, and whatever followed. If he was caught by the person he had stolen from, the response was immediate and physical. A blow from a fist, a kick from a boot, the rough hands of neighbors who had been summoned by the shout of "Stop, thief!" This was the first judgment, delivered in the street, in the mud, with the blood hot and the anger fresh. If he survived this initial punishment, he would be hauled before a local authority, a constable or a magistrate, a man whose word was law and whose decisions were guided more by custom and personal whim than by any written code. The punishments were designed not for rehabilitation, but for deterrence and for public display. The stocks were a common sentence for minor theft. The thief would be led to the town square, where his ankles and sometimes his wrists were locked into a heavy wooden frame. He would be forced to sit there, hunched and helpless, for hours, sometimes for a full day or more. The sun would beat down on him, or the rain would soak him to the skin, and the people would pass by. Some would ignore him, some would mutter darkly. Others, often the children, would throw things, rotten vegetables, handfuls of mud, stones if the mood was particularly cruel. There was no dignity in the stocks, only exposure and humiliation, a slow, grinding lesson in public shame. For more serious offenses, or for those who were caught a second time, the punishment escalated to branding. The thief would be tied to a post in the presence of the same crowd that had mocked him in the stocks. A blacksmith would heat an iron in his forge until it glowed a dull, terrible red. The iron was shaped into a letter, a T for thief, or perhaps a V for vagabond. Then, with a hiss and the smell of burning flesh, the mark was pressed into the skin, usually on the cheek or the forehead. The pain was immense, a searing, blinding shock that left the victim trembling and faint. But the physical pain was only part of the punishment. The brand was permanent. It was a sign, worn for the rest of his life, that announced his crime to everyone he met. It barred him from honest work, from decent company, from any hope of a normal life. He was marked, and the mark would never fade. Flogging was another common sentence, one that bridged the gap between shame and mutilation. The thief would be stripped to the waist and tied to a cart or a post. The executioner, or sometimes a constable with a strong arm, would wield a whip made of knotted cords or leather. The lash would fall across the bare back, again and again, each stroke raising a welt, then breaking the skin. The crowd would count the strokes, their voices rising with each number. 10, 20, 30. The goal was not just to inflict pain, but to create a lasting memory, a lattice of scars that would serve as a constant reminder of the cost of transgression. The back of a convicted thief was a map of his crimes, written in raised, white lines. And then there was the ultimate punishment, the one that waited at the end of the road for every thief who pushed his luck too far or whose crime was deemed too great to be answered with a mere branding or flogging. The gallows. They were a permanent fixture on the landscape of every town, a wooden structure that stood on a hill or at a crossroads, its crossbeam a dark line against the sky. Executions were public events, held on market days so that the maximum number of people could attend. The condemned would be brought from his cell, often in a cart, his hands bound. He might be allowed a final word, or he might be met with silence. A crowd would gather, not necessarily bloodthirsty, but curious, drawn by the spectacle, by the drama of a life coming to its end. The rope would be placed around his neck, the knot adjusted behind his ear. Then, with a thud, the trapdoor would fall, and the body would drop, a sudden, jerking motion that ended everything. The body would sometimes be left hanging, a grim effigy swaying in the wind for days, a silent warning to all who passed beneath its shadow. But before such an end, or even before the stocks, there was the constant, grinding misery of the thief's daily existence. There was no glamour in the hiding places. A man might sleep in an abandoned hovel, its roof half collapsed, the wind whistling through gaps in the walls. He might burrow into a haystack, the dry stalks pricking his skin and the warmth of the decomposing hay providing a meager, damp heat. He might find a corner in a stable, sharing the space with horses and their attendant vermin, the smell of manure and sweat a constant blanket. Bathing was a luxury he could not afford, and not merely for lack of water. To wash meant to remove the layer of grime and smell that, in its own way, was a form of camouflage. To the dogs and to the people, a clean man was an anomaly, someone who did not belong. The thief needed to smell of the streets, of the animals, of the dirt, to blend into the background of a world that was itself permanently unwashed. His clothing was a testament to his profession. It was not the elegant, dark garb of a fictional burglar. It was whatever he could find or steal, patched and repatched until the original fabric was nearly invisible beneath layers of crude stitching. A tunic that had once been brown would fade to a streaked, indeterminate gray. Hose that might have fit a decade ago were now tied up with scraps of cord. His shoes, if he had them, were worn thin, the soles mere flaps of leather that did little to protect his feet from the cold, wet mud of the streets. In winter, the cold was a constant, living enemy. It seeped into the bones, turning fingers stiff and clumsy, making the simple act of lifting a latch a trial of endurance. Frostbite was a common companion, turning toes and fingertips black and sending a dull, throbbing pain through the extremities. The pursuit, when it came, was a chaotic, desperate affair. It rarely happened in the silent, shadowed streets of the night. It happened in the broad light of day, in the crowded market, where a snatched purse was immediately noticed. The cry would go up, a high, piercing shout that cut through the din of commerce. "Stop him! Thief!" And then the chase would begin. It was not a clean race down an open road. It was a frantic scramble through a labyrinth of narrow, twisting lanes. The thief would dodge around carts laden with goods, leap over piles of refuse, shove past startled pedestrians. The crowd, in an instant, would transform from a passive mass into a hostile force. Hands would reach out to grab him, feet would try to trip him. A woman with a basket would swing it at his head. A butcher, cleaver in hand, would step from his stall, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. The thief's lungs would burn, his legs would ache, and the fear would give him a desperate, fleeting speed. Even if he broke free of the immediate crowd, the town itself conspired against him. Alleys that looked like passages often ended in blank walls. A gate that was open one day might be barred the next. The layout of the streets, grown organically over centuries, was a maze with no logic, full of dead ends and sudden drops. If he made it to the fields beyond the town walls, the landscape offered little comfort. The open ground gave no cover, and the plowed earth was heavy and cloying underfoot, slowing every stride. The forest, when he reached it, was not a sanctuary but a new kind of danger. It was the domain of other outcasts, men just as desperate as he was, who would rob him of his meager gains without a second thought, and perhaps leave him bleeding in a ditch for the trouble. The community of thieves, if it could be called a community, was a loose and shifting collection of individuals bound only by shared desperation. There was no honor among them, no code of loyalty. They were competitors, each vying for the same scarce resources. A man might share a fire with another thief one night, only to have his boots stolen while he slept. He might hear of a promising target, only to arrive and find it already picked clean by someone else who had heard the same rumor. Trust was a liability, a weakness that would be exploited. The only bond was the immediate, temporary bond of mutual need, and it dissolved the moment the need was gone. In the rare moments when a theft was successful, when the coin was actually in his hand or the food was in his mouth, there was a brief, hollow satisfaction. It was not triumph, merely a temporary reprieve from the relentless pressure of want. He would find a quiet corner, a place where he would not be seen, and he would eat quickly, furtively, like an animal. The taste of stolen food was always the same, tinged with the metallic tang of fear. Afterwards, there was only the hollow feeling of the stomach being full, and the immediate return of the old, familiar dread, the knowledge that this moment of peace was fleeting, and that the search for the next meal would begin again with the next dawn. There was no retirement from this life, no peaceful old age spent by a fire. A thief grew old only if he was very, very lucky or very, very cautious. And if he did, he grew old as he had lived on the margins. His body, worn by years of exposure, hard labor, and occasional violence, would begin to fail him. His hands, once quick enough to lift a purse, would become stiff and slow. His eyes, once sharp enough to spot a sleeping guard, would grow dim. He could no longer run, could no longer fight. At this point, he would slip from thief to beggar, his brand or his missing teeth serving as his only credentials. He would sit in a church porch, his hand outstretched, hoping for the charity of those he had once tried to steal from. It was a slow, quiet end, a fading into the stonework and the shadows, until one morning he simply did not wake up, and his body was taken away to an unmarked grave, another forgotten piece of the medieval landscape. In a different time and in a different part of the world, a woman was born who would defy the very structures that confined her. Her name was Khutulun, and she came into the world around the year 1260 on the vast, windswept grasslands of Central Asia. This was the heart of the Mongol world, a place where the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, and life was measured in the movement of horses and the changing of the seasons. Her father was Kaidu Khan, a powerful and ambitious ruler, a descendant of Genghis Khan himself, who controlled a vast territory that resisted the rule of his cousin, Kublai Khan, far to the east in China. From her earliest moments, Khutulun was immersed in a world of constant motion, of felt tents called jers that could be taken down and packed onto carts in a matter of hours, of herds of horses and sheep that stretched across the valleys, and of a people whose very survival depended on their strength, their speed, and their skill with a bow. In this world, the lines between the lives of men and women were not drawn as sharply as they were in the sedentary civilizations to the south and west. Mongol women managed the herds, ran the households, and wielded significant influence in family and tribal councils. They rode horses from the time they could walk, and many were skilled archers. But even within this relatively freer society, Khutulun stood apart. From childhood, she showed a remarkable aptitude for the physical pursuits of her culture. She did not merely learn to ride. She mastered the horse, becoming one with the animal in a way that left seasoned riders in awe. She did not merely learn to shoot. She could hit a moving target at a full gallop with a precision that was both beautiful and terrifying to witness. Her father, Kaidu, watched her development with a mixture of pride and calculation. He had many sons, but none possessed the sheer, unyielding spirit of his daughter. He began to include her in his military campaigns, not as a spectator but as a participant. She rode with his armies, learning the tactics of steppe warfare, the feigned retreats, the sudden, devastating ambushes, the ability to coordinate the movements of thousands of horsemen across open country without the need for written orders. She proved herself not merely capable, but exceptional. Her courage on the battlefield was absolute. She would charge into the thick of a fight, her bow singing, her war cry rising above the clash of weapons. Soldiers who saw her fight forgot she was a woman. They saw only a commander, a warrior whose skill and ferocity inspired them and terrified their enemies. Her reputation grew with each campaign. Chroniclers from distant lands, men like Marco Polo, would later write of her with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. They described her as a warrior of immense physical strength, a woman who could ride into enemy ranks and snatch a prisoner from his horse as easily as an eagle takes a lamb. They spoke of her prowess in the Mongol national sport of wrestling, a grueling test of strength, balance, and endurance that could last for hours. In a society that revered wrestling champions, Khutulun became one. She would challenge the strongest men of her father's court, and she would throw them to the ground, time and again. Her victories met with cheers and the stomping of boots. This wrestling prowess became the foundation of her most famous legend. As she reached marriageable age, suitors began to arrive at her father's camp. They were princes and chieftains from across Asia, drawn by her beauty, her lineage, and the immense political power that an alliance with Kaidu would bring. But Khutulun had no interest in being a political prize. She issued a challenge. Any man who wished to marry her must first defeat her in a wrestling match. If he won, she would be his wife. If he lost, he would forfeit 100 horses to her. The challenge was accepted again and again. One by one, the suitors stepped into the ring. They were strong men, warriors who had never been bested. But one by one, they found themselves lifted, turned, and slammed into the dirt by the princess. Some were thrown quickly, their pride shattered in a matter of moments. Others fought for hours, their strength waning as Khutulun's seemed only to grow. With each victory, her herd of horses swelled. Legend says she amassed a herd of 10,000 this way, though the number is likely more symbolic than literal. What mattered was the message. She could not be bought, could not be won by status or wealth. She could only be earned by strength, and no man was strong enough. The tale of her wrestling challenge spread across the steppe and beyond, carried by traders and travelers. It added a layer of myth to her already formidable reputation. To her own people, she became a symbol of their fierce, unconquered spirit. She was proof that their values of strength and skill transcended gender. To outsiders, she was a marvel, an anomaly, a story that was almost too strange to be believed. But it was true. In the wrestling ring of her father's gur, in the heart of the Mongol Empire, a woman stood undefeated, a living legend in her own time. Her bond with her father was the central relationship of her life. Kaidu trusted her above all his other children. She was his advisor in council and his right hand in battle. He saw in her the qualities he valued most: loyalty, intelligence, and an unbreakable will. As he grew older, and the question of his succession became more pressing, a radical thought began to form in his mind. He considered naming Khutulun as his heir. In the history of the Mongol Empire, a woman had never ruled a khanate outright. Women had served as regents, had wielded power behind the throne, but to sit on it oneself, to command the loyalty of the tribal chieftains and the armies, was unheard of. Yet Kaidu believed his daughter was capable of it. He believed she was the best person to carry on his legacy. The idea, however, was met with fierce resistance. Her brothers, 14 of them, watched their father's favoritism with growing jealousy and resentment. They were proud men, warriors in their own right, and they could not bear the thought of being passed over for their sister. The tribal elders, the powerful men whose support was essential for any ruler, were equally aghast. Tradition, they argued, was tradition. A woman could not lead them. It would bring chaos, dishonor, and the scorn of their rivals. Whispers began to circulate, dark and poisonous rumors about the nature of Khutulun's relationship with her father. Accusations designed to undermine her moral standing and turn the court against her. Kaidu, despite his power, could not fully ignore the pressure. He saw the storm that naming his daughter as heir would create, a storm that could tear his khanate apart in civil war even before he was cold in his grave. He wavered, and in his wavering, the moment passed. He never officially named her as his successor, leaving the question unresolved at his death in 1301. For Khutulun, it was a bitter blow. She had spent her life proving herself, had fought and bled for her father and his people, and in the end, the old traditions, the old prejudices had closed the door in her face. Following her father's death, the succession struggle she had feared erupted. Her brothers fought amongst themselves, and with other claimants, for control of the khanate. Khutulun, despite being sidelined from the ultimate prize, remained a powerful force. She still commanded the loyalty of her own warriors, a formidable contingent that any claimant would be foolish to ignore. She played a role in the subsequent power struggles, supporting one brother, then another, as alliances shifted and broke. But the fire of her own ambition, the dream of ruling, was banked. She was a kingmaker now, not a king. Around this time, perhaps as a political move to solidify an alliance or to quell the persistent rumors, Khutulun did eventually marry. The historical records are frustratingly vague on this point. Some sources say she married a man who had been accused of plotting against her father, and that she wed him as a public demonstration of his innocence. Others suggest the marriage was a practical, political arrangement with a chieftain from a powerful allied tribe. What is clear is that the marriage was not the result of her wrestling challenge. No man had ever bested her. The vow, after years of holding firm, was quietly set aside, another casualty of political reality. But even as a wife, she did not retreat into domesticity. She continued to ride and to fight, to command her warriors and to be a presence on the steppe that could not be ignored. She lived for 5 more years after her father's death, a figure of immense prestige and lingering power, until her own death in 1306. The cause is unknown. In the chaos of the steppe, in an era before detailed record-keeping, a life could end in 100 ways: a wound gone bad, a fever, a fall from a horse, or perhaps a more deliberate hand, a final act of political elimination. She simply vanishes from the chronicles, her story complete. But the memory of her did not vanish. It was carried in the oral traditions of the Mongol people, told around campfires for generations. The story of the princess who could not be thrown, the warrior who fought beside her father, the woman who almost ruled an empire. Her legend took on a life of its own, traveling far beyond the steppe. In the 18th century, a French playwright encountered a version of her story and adapted it into a play. The wrestling challenge became a battle of wits, a series of riddles. The warrior princess became a cold, unapproachable beauty. This play, in turn, became the basis for Puccini's famous opera, Turandot. In this form, her story reached millions, though her name and much of her truth was lost. The core remained, the story of a woman who refused to be a prize, who demanded that any man who wanted her must prove himself worthy. But the Khutulun of the opera is a figure of icy fantasy, not the flesh and blood warrior of the steppe. Today, in Mongolia and Central Asia, there is a movement to reclaim her true story. She is celebrated as a national hero, a symbol of female strength and independence. Statues have been raised in her honor, depicting her not as a delicate princess, but as a powerful warrior on horseback. Her story is taught in schools, retold in books, and invoked as an inspiration for young women. The wrestling champion, the undefeated competitor, the loyal daughter, the forgotten queen, she lives on, not as a myth, but as a memory of what was possible. A reminder that even in a world built by and for men, a woman could rise, could fight, could stand undefeated, and could leave a mark that 1,000 years could not erase. The world of the steppe, which shaped Khutulun, was also a world that developed its own unique and profound approach to the challenges of sickness and injury. Nomadic medicine was not a system of hospitals and textbooks, but a living, breathing practice carried in the minds and hands of the people and adapted to the constant motion of their lives. To understand it is to understand a different way of seeing the human body and its place in the world. The healer on the steppe did not work in a sterile room, but under the vast dome of the sky, with the wind as a companion and the earth as a pharmacy. The central figure in this system was the shaman. The shaman was not merely a doctor, but a bridge between the visible and invisible worlds. In the nomadic understanding, illness was rarely a purely physical event. It could be caused by a wound or a broken bone, yes, but it could also be caused by a displeased spirit, by an ancestor who had been forgotten, by a curse laid by an enemy, or by the loss of one's own soul. The shaman was the one who could see these hidden causes. Through ritual, drumming, and trance, they would journey into the spirit world to diagnose the problem and negotiate for the patient's return to health. The rituals themselves were powerful sensory experiences. The shaman would dress in a regalia of fur, feathers, and iron, adorned with bells and mirrors that would catch the light of the fire. The rhythmic beat of a drum, made from animal hides stretched over a wooden frame, would set a steady, hypnotic pulse. The shaman would chant, their voice rising and falling, sometimes speaking in the tongues of animals or spirits. They might dance around the patient, using their movements to draw out the sickness, or they might use a knife to symbolically cut the bonds of an illness. The smoke of juniper or artemisia would fill the tent, its sharp, cleansing scent driving away malevolent forces. To a modern eye, it might look like theater. To the people of the steppe, it was a life-or-death struggle played out on a spiritual plane, a battle for the soul of a clan member. Alongside this spiritual practice, there was a deep and practical knowledge of the natural world. The steppe was a vast storehouse of medicinal plants, and every elder, every mother, every herder knew something of their uses. The knowledge was not written down, but passed from generation to generation by word and example. A child watching their grandmother prepare a poultice learned the recipe. A young man helping to treat a wounded horse learned how to stop bleeding and bind a fracture. This knowledge was communal, shared, and constantly tested by experience. Yarrow, with its flat-topped clusters of white flowers, was one of the most valued plants. Its leaves, when crushed, could be applied to a wound to staunch the flow of blood. Willow bark, common along the waterways that cut through the grasslands, was chewed or brewed into a tea to reduce fever and ease the pain of aching joints. The active compound, salicin, is a natural precursor to modern aspirin, a fact that validates the wisdom of those who discovered its properties centuries ago. Juniper berries, besides their use in spiritual cleansing, were brewed into a tonic for stomach ailments and used in steam baths to clear the lungs. The bond between the nomads and their animals meant that veterinary knowledge was just as developed as human medicine. A herder could look at a horse and see the first signs of colic, a potentially fatal digestive blockage. The treatment might involve walking the animal slowly, administering a drench of herbal tea, or massaging its belly to stimulate movement. A goat with an infected wound would have it cleaned and dressed with the same care as a human patient. The fat of sheep or yaks was rendered and used as a salve for chapped skin, frostbite, and to protect wounds from the harsh winter air. There was no separation. The health of the people and the health of the herd were one and the same. Injuries were a constant reality of nomadic life. A fall from a horse could break a leg. A fight with a rival tribe could leave deep cuts. A long, freezing winter could result in frostbite so severe that fingers or toes would turn black and die. The healers developed techniques to deal with these traumas. Bones were set with splints made from wood or leather, and the limb was immobilized. Wounds were cauterized with a heated iron, a brutal but effective way to stop bleeding and prevent infection. The patient would scream, and the smell of burning flesh would fill the air, but the treatment often meant the difference between life and a slow death from sepsis. Sutures were made from horsehair or sinew, threaded through a bone needle. The body was treated with a practical, unsentimental efficiency born of necessity. Childbirth was another dangerous threshold. Women gave birth in the family gur, attended by midwives whose knowledge was the accumulated wisdom of generations. The mother would often deliver in a squatting or kneeling position, using gravity to assist the process. Herbs were used to stimulate contractions and to control bleeding after the birth. The umbilical cord would be cut with a clean knife and tied with a thread. The newborn, having survived its first great trial, would be washed, wrapped in soft felt, and presented to the family. Infant mortality was high, a constant shadow over every birth, and the survival of both mother and child was a cause for profound celebration and relief, a victory against the odds. The nomadic understanding of health was holistic, encompassing the body, the mind, the spirit, and the community. An illness that could not be explained by a physical cause was assumed to be spiritual. Depression, anxiety, the trauma of a battle or a loss, these were seen as wounds of the soul, requiring spiritual healing. The shaman's rituals, the support of the clan, the familiar rhythms of daily life, all worked together to restore the person to wholeness. The sick were not isolated, but held within the community. Their recovery was everyone's concern, for the strength of the group depended on the health of each of its members. This system, born on the windswept grasslands, was remarkably resilient. It adapted as the nomads moved, incorporating new plants and new knowledge from the lands they passed through. It survived the rise and fall of empires, the pressures of neighboring civilizations, and the slow, inexorable march of time. Elements of it persist to this day, in the traditional medicine of Mongolia and Central Asia, in the practices of rural herders, and in the growing global interest in holistic and plant-based healing. It serves as a reminder that there are other ways of understanding the body and its place in the world, ways that do not depend on laboratories and technology, but on observation, experience, and a deep, intimate connection to the land and to the community. In the damp, gray light of a medieval morning, a man might wake in the shadow of a church, his only blanket the threadbare tunic he had worn for months. He would watch the townspeople emerge from their doors, their faces set in the familiar lines of worry and weariness. They would pass him without a glance, or with a glance that held only a flicker of recognition, the acknowledgement of a familiar piece of the urban landscape, like a broken cart will left to rot in a ditch. He was there, but not there, a part of their world only in his absence from it. The day would stretch before him, a long, empty corridor of hours to be filled with the slow, patient work of staying alive, a task that required no plan, only a constant, low-level vigilance and the willingness to take a risk when the moment, however brief, presented itself. He might spend the morning watching a particular stall, noting the habits of the merchant, the times when his attention wandered, the flow of the crowd around his wares. He would stand in doorways, shift his weight from foot to foot, his eyes never quite still, always scanning, always assessing. The sun would climb, and the heat of the day would bring out the smells of the town more strongly, the rot of vegetables, the sharp tang of urine from the gutters, the smoke from 100 cooking fires. The hunger would be a constant companion, a hollow ache that was as familiar as his own heartbeat. It was not a sharp, sudden pain, but a dull, persistent presence that colored every thought and every calculation. In the afternoon, if he was fortunate, he might find a piece of discarded bread, or a half-rotten apple that had fallen from a cart and been overlooked. He would eat it quickly, furtively, in a corner, his back to the wall, his eyes on the passers-by. The taste was irrelevant. It was merely fuel, a brief cessation of the ache. The rest of the day would be spent in the same slow, circular observation, moving from one vantage point to another, a ghost in the margins of a world that was too busy with its own struggles to pay him much mind. As evening fell, and the light began to drain from the sky, a different kind of energy would stir in the town. The merchants would close their stalls, the laborers would trudge home, and the doors would be barred. The streets would empty, and the quiet would settle in, a quiet punctuated only by the occasional bark of a dog, the creak of a sign swinging in the breeze, the distant murmur of voices from behind closed shutters. For the thief, this was the beginning of his working day. He would wait until the darkness was complete, until the last candle had been extinguished and the town had slipped into the shallow, uneasy sleep of the Middle Ages. He would move then, a darker shape against the darkness, his path chosen not for its directness but for its cover. He knew every alley, every shadowed doorway, every pile of refuse that could hide a crouching man. He moved with a slow, deliberate patience, his senses attuned to the slightest sound, the creak of a shutter, the snore of a sleeper through a thin wall, the soft pad of a cat's feet on the cobbles. The air would be cooler now, carrying the smells of the night, the damp earth, the smoke from banked fires, the distant, sweet scent of a hayfield beyond the town walls. He was a creature of this liminal hour, belonging neither to the day that had passed nor to the one that was yet to come. A successful night might yield a small leather purse, carelessly left on a table near an unshuttered window. The coins inside would be few, copper pennies mostly, perhaps a single silver piece if luck was truly with him. He would weigh it in his hand, feeling the cold, hard reality of his gain, before melting back into the shadows. The coins would buy him a meal, a place in a warm stable for a night or two, a brief respite from the constant pressure. But the respite would be temporary, and the cycle would begin again. The fear, the hunger, the cold, they were not events but a continuous state of being, the very texture of his existence. It was a life lived entirely in the present tense, a life without past or future, a simple, grinding equation of need and risk, played out in the mud and darkness of a world that had no place for him. The weight of the coins, once spent, would leave behind only the memory of their brief comfort, and the old familiar emptiness would return, pressing against his ribs like a living thing. He would find himself once again in the margins, watching the world from a distance, a world that moved with a purpose he did not share and a rhythm he could not join. The hours would pass in a kind of suspended animation, the mind drifting between the sharp focus of need and the dull fog of simply waiting for something, anything, to change. But nothing ever changed, not really. The sun would rise and set, the seasons would turn, the rain would fall and freeze, and he would remain, a fixed point in a shifting landscape, defined not by who he was, but by what he had been forced to become. There were moments, usually in the long, cold hours before dawn, when the weight of it all would press down with a particular heaviness. Huddled in a corner of a hayloft, listening to the soft breathing of the horses below and the scratch of rats in the straw, he might think of the life he could have had. Not a life of wealth or comfort, but a simple life, a life with a place, with a name that was spoken without a sneer. A life where he might sit by his own fire, in his own small room, and feel, just for a moment, that he belonged somewhere. But these thoughts were dangerous. They softened the hard edge of survival, the constant, necessary vigilance. He would push them away, bury them beneath the immediate concerns of the coming day, the need to find food, to stay warm, to avoid the eyes of the watch. The past was a luxury he could not afford, and the future was a concept that had no meaning in a world where each sunrise was a question mark. The daily routine of survival was a patchwork of small, ignoble acts. There was the begging, a performance of misery that required one to look as pitiful as possible, to hold out a hand that was suitably dirty and trembling, to catch the eye of a passerby with just the right amount of desperate hope. It was a trade, like any other, exchanging a display of suffering for a copper coin or a crust of bread. There was the scavenging, a careful examination of the day's refuse behind the market stalls, a search for anything that could be eaten or sold, a half-rotted turnip, a bone with a scrap of gristle still attached, a piece of cloth that could be used to patch a hole. And there was the waiting, the endless, patient waiting for the moment when an opportunity would present itself, a door left ajar, a purse left unattended, a moment of distraction that could be seized and turned into a meal. The sensory world of the medieval town was a constant, overwhelming presence. It was a world of smells, layered and complex, that could change from one street to the next. The sharp, acrid smell of the tanner's yard, where hides soaked in vats of urine and lime. The sweet, yeasty smell of the baker's ovens, a torment to the hungry. The pervasive, earthy smell of the midden heaps, where the town's waste accumulated, breeding flies and a permanent, low-level stench. The smell of wood smoke, of cooking grease, of sweat and unwashed bodies, all mingled together in a thick, palpable atmosphere that seemed to settle on the skin and cling to the clothes. It was a world of sounds, too. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of cart wheels on cobblestones, the cries of street vendors, the squabble of dogs, the muttered conversations of passers-by. And beneath it all, a constant low-level hum of activity, a sound that never fully ceased, even in the deepest part of the night. For a woman, the margins were even narrower and more dangerous. A woman alone was a target, not just for the authorities, but for every man who crossed her path. She might seek work as a servant, but without a reference, without a known name, the door was usually closed. She might turn to the oldest profession, a desperate trade that offered a bed for the night in exchange for the use of her body, a transaction that left her not just hungry, but hollowed out. Her sense of self eroded a little more with each encounter. Or she might attach herself to a man, becoming his partner in theft and his companion in the cold. A relationship built on shared desperation that could turn violent at any moment. The stories of female thieves are fewer in the records, not because they did not exist, but because their lives were often even more quickly erased, their voices even more thoroughly silenced. In the hierarchy of the medieval underworld, there were those who managed to rise above the simple, desperate scramble for survival. These were the career criminals, the men who had made theft into a profession. They might specialize in a particular skill, like cutting purses in a crowd, a delicate operation that required a steady hand and an intimate understanding of human behavior. They might work in small groups, one to distract the mark, another to perform the theft, a third to pass the stolen goods to a fourth who was already melting away into the crowd. They knew the fences, the men who would buy stolen goods with no questions asked, taking a hefty commission for their silence and their connections. They knew the safe houses, the taverns and inns where the owners were willing to look the other way for a share of the profits. They existed in a shadow economy, a parallel world that ran alongside the legitimate one, with its own rules, its own hierarchies, and its own very real dangers. But even for these professionals, the life was precarious. A single mistake, a moment of bad luck, a betrayal by a supposed friend, and the entire edifice could come crashing down. The long arm of the law, however clumsy and arbitrary, could still reach them. A rival might inform on them to the authorities, settling a score or clearing the way for their own operations. A fence might decide they were more trouble than they were worth and refuse to deal with them, cutting off their only means of converting stolen goods into coin. And always, there was the risk of the victim themselves. A man who turned at the wrong moment, a woman who felt the tug on her purse and screamed, a crowd that was faster to react than expected. The thrill of a successful theft, if it could be called a thrill, was always followed by the long, slow, cold aftermath of paranoia, the constant looking over the shoulder, the start at every sudden sound. The passage of time in this world was measured not in years, but in winters. Each winter was a trial, a long, slow siege of cold and hunger that thinned the ranks of the desperate. The old and the weak, the sick and the injured, they would simply not be there when the spring thaw came. Their bodies would be found in doorways, in ditches, in the corners of abandoned buildings, frozen stiff, their faces sometimes bearing a look of strange, peaceful surprise. They would be carted away and buried in unmarked ground, their names forgotten, their stories ended without a final chapter. To survive a winter was to have beaten the odds, to have earned another year of the same struggle, a victory that felt, in the gray light of a spring morning, more like a postponement than a triumph. And yet, life persisted. Children were born in the margins, to mothers who had nothing to give them but their own thin milk and the fierce, desperate love of those who know their time is borrowed. These children grew up knowing only this world. They learned to beg before they could walk, to steal before they could read. They played in the gutters, their toys the discarded bones and bits of wood they found there. They were the future of the margins, a new generation destined to repeat the same cycle of hunger and fear, unless something, some stroke of impossible luck, some act of unexpected kindness, pulled them from its grip. But such strokes were rare, and kindness was a commodity as scarce as a silver coin. For most, the path was set from the moment of their birth in a haystack or a hovel, a path that led with a grim predictability to the stocks, the brand, the flogging, and finally, for the unlucky or the careless, to the rope. The life within the walls of a Victorian asylum was a study in the slow erosion of the self. The architecture itself was designed to enforce this, with its long, echoing corridors, its high, barred windows that let in light but offered no view of the world beyond, its doors that locked from the outside with a heavy, definitive clang. The air was thick with the smell of carbolic soap, boiled cabbage, and something else, a faint, underlying odor of fear and despair that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. The patients, or inmates as they were often called, moved through this space in a kind of slow, ritualized dance, their days measured out in meals, in periods of enforced exercise in the airing courts, in long, empty hours of sitting and staring at walls. The routine was the same day after day. A bell would ring at a fixed hour, and the inmates would be roused from their narrow, iron-framed beds. They would stand in lines, waiting to use the communal washing facilities, a few cold basins of water and rough towels. They would be marched to the dining hall, where they would be served a bland, monotonous diet of bread, gruel, and weak tea. Then the long morning would begin. Some would be set to work, scrubbing floors, mending clothes, working in the asylum's laundry or kitchen. This was not therapy in the modern sense. It was labor, unpaid and compulsory, designed to keep the inmates occupied and to reduce the cost of running the vast institutions. Others, deemed too ill or too disruptive for work, would be left to sit in the day rooms, long, bare spaces lined with benches, where they would rock, mutter, or simply stare into the middle distance, their minds adrift in worlds the attendants could not see. The attendants themselves were a mixed group. Some were kindly, drawn to the work by a genuine, if often misguided, sense of compassion. They might offer a kind word, a gentle touch on the shoulder, a small, illicit treat to a favorite patient. But they were vastly outnumbered. The asylums were chronically understaffed, and the work was hard, poorly paid, and often dangerous. Many attendants were brutal, their patience worn thin by the constant demands of the job. They would use force to subdue a difficult patient, a quick slap, a rough shove, the threat of the straitjacket or the padded cell. They saw the inmates not as people, but as problems to be managed, bodies to be fed, washed, and controlled. The treatments, when they were applied, were often indistinguishable from punishment. The cold bath was a favorite. An inmate judged to be excitable or agitated would be stripped and immersed in a bath of cold water, sometimes for hours, a canvas cover strapped over the top to prevent them from getting out. The theory was that the shock would calm the nerves, would cool the overheated brain. The reality was shivering, misery, and a profound sense of humiliation. The rotary machine was another invention, a device that spun the patient around at high speed, supposedly to redistribute the blood and cure a variety of mental ills. It left them dizzy, nauseated, and terrified. The tranquilizer chair, a wooden contraption that restrained the patient's head, arms, and legs, sometimes for days at a time, was used for those who were restless or violent. It did not tranquilize. It imprisoned, forcing the body into a state of rigid, uncomfortable stillness. For women, the asylum was a place where the strictures of Victorian society were amplified and enforced with a terrifying physicality. A diagnosis of hysteria could be applied to almost any behavior that deviated from the ideal of the passive, domestic, submissive woman. A woman who was too intelligent, who read too many books, who expressed opinions too forcefully, could be labeled hysterical. A woman who was grieving, who wept too long or too loudly for a dead child or husband, was displaying an unhealthy excess of emotion, a sign of mental instability. A woman who was angry, who fought against the constraints of her life, who refused to obey her husband or her father, was clearly mad. The asylum became a tool for controlling these women, for silencing their voices and confining their bodies. The treatments for female patients were often specifically designed to enforce sexual control. Clitoridectomy, the surgical removal of the clitoris, was performed on women diagnosed with nymphomania or excessive masturbation. procedure that was nothing less than a brutal surgical assault intended to erase female pleasure and enforce a state of passive, desexualized compliance. The newly invented vibrator was used by some doctors to treat hysteria by inducing a hysterical paroxysm, a euphemism for orgasm, which was believed to relieve the built-up pressure of female sexual frustration. The treatment was deeply invasive, a clinical act that reduced the woman's body to a machine to be manipulated by a male authority figure. The children in the asylums were perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. They were often not mad in any meaningful sense of the word. They were simply different. A child who was slow to learn, who had seizures, who was born with a physical deformity, who was simply too difficult for a poor family to manage, could be committed. They were housed in special wards, or in separate institutions altogether, places with names like idiot asylums that reflected the cruel, unenlightened attitudes of the time. They were given little education, no meaningful stimulation, and minimal affection. They spent their days in bare rooms, rocking, staring, their young minds and bodies slowly withering from the sheer lack of engagement with the world. Some were subjected to the same brutal treatments as the adults, strapped into chairs, doused with cold water, dosed with sedatives. They grew up, if they grew up at all, within the walls, knowing nothing of the world outside, their childhood stolen by a system that saw them only as a burden. The elderly, too, filled the asylums. Those suffering from what we now recognize as dementia or Alzheimer's, their minds slowly clouding, their memories fragmenting, were labeled with terms like senile insanity. They were placed in the asylum not because there was any hope of treatment, but because there was nowhere else for them to go. Their families could not or would not care for them, and the workhouses, the other great dumping ground for the Victorian poor, would pass them along when their confusion became too much to manage. In the asylum, they would be given a bed and a basic level of care, but no one would try to reach them, to engage with the person still flickering behind the confused eyes. They would sit, sometimes for years, in a state of quiet bewilderment, until finally, one day, they would simply stop breathing, and their bodies would be taken away to the asylum cemetery, to a grave marked only by a number. The long, slow afternoons in the asylum were the worst. The morning's activities, such as they were, would be over. The midday meal, a thin broth and a piece of bread, would have been consumed. The hours until supper stretched out, an endless, featureless plane of time. The inmates would sit in the day rooms, the light from the high windows falling in pale rectangles on the worn floorboards. Some would talk to themselves, carrying on conversations with invisible companions. Some would pace back and forth, a restless, repetitive movement that could go on for hours. Some would simply sit, their hands folded in their laps, their faces empty, their eyes fixed on a point that no one else could see. The air would be heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional cough, the shuffle of feet, the distant clang of a door. It was a waiting for nothing, a waiting that had become a way of life. The night brought a different kind of quiet, but not necessarily a quieter one. The dormitories, long rooms lined with beds, would be filled with the sounds of sleep, the snoring, the muttering, the sudden cries of those trapped in nightmares. The night attendants would make their rounds, their footsteps echoing in the corridors, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In the padded cells, the most disturbed inmates would be alone in the darkness, their screams muffled by the thick quilting on the walls. The asylum at night was a place of hidden sounds and half-seen shapes, a place where the boundary between the waking world and the world of dreams, between sanity and madness, seemed to dissolve entirely. For those confined within, the outside world became a distant memory, a place that grew less and less real with each passing year. Letters from family might arrive or they might not. Visits were rare. The inmates became institutionalized, their identities slowly subsumed by the routines and rhythms of the asylum. They learned to be quiet, to be compliant, to not draw attention to themselves. They learned that any display of individuality, any spark of spirit, would be met with punishment. They became ghosts, haunting the long corridors, their lives reduced to a simple, biological existence, eating, sleeping, breathing, waiting for an end that, for many, could not come soon enough. The struggle for reform was a slow, difficult process, a battle against entrenched interests, public apathy, and the sheer, overwhelming inertia of a system that had grown vast and powerful. Men and women of conscience, doctors, politicians, and former patients themselves began to speak out, to publish accounts of the abuses they had witnessed, to demand that the asylums be held accountable. They described the overcrowding, the brutality of the attendants, the uselessness of the treatments, the ease with which sane people could be committed and then forgotten. Their accounts were shocking, and they began to stir the public conscience. The government, slowly and reluctantly, responded. The Lunacy Act of 1845 was a landmark piece of legislation, creating a central board of commissioners in lunacy with the power to inspect asylums and to report on their conditions. The law required that asylums be registered, that detailed records be kept on each patient, and that mechanical restraints be used only as a last resort. In theory, it was a triumph of reform. In practice, its impact was limited. The inspections were often superficial, announced in advance so that the worst conditions could be temporarily hidden. The commissioners were understaffed and overworked, unable to keep up with the rapid expansion of the asylum system. Restraints were still used, just recorded differently. Patients were still abused, just more quietly. The reformers did not give up. They continued to push, to investigate, to publish. They formed organizations dedicated to the humane treatment of the insane. They lobbied for more funding, for better training for attendants, for a more scientific approach to mental illness. They challenged the very foundations of the asylum system, arguing that these vast, isolated institutions were inherently damaging, that they removed people from their communities and their families and placed them in an artificial, unhealthy environment. They advocated for small, local asylums, for treatment in the community, for a more humane and individualized approach to care. By the end of the 19th century, the asylum system had become a paradox. It was, on one hand, a monument to Victorian philanthropy, a visible sign that society was taking responsibility for its most vulnerable members. The grand, Gothic buildings, with their sweeping driveways and manicured grounds, were intended to project an image of order, compassion, and scientific progress. But behind the facades, the reality was often very different. The asylums had become warehouses for the unwanted, places where the poor, the inconvenient, the different, and the truly ill were all thrown together and left to rot. The grand vision of moral treatment, of curing the insane through kindness and meaningful activity, had been lost in a sea of red tape, underfunding, and overcrowding. The voices of the patients themselves, the ones who had lived through the experience, were perhaps the most powerful of all. A few managed to escape and write their memoirs, detailing the horrors they had endured. Their stories were published and widely read, giving a human face to the abstract statistics of the asylum reports. They spoke of being committed by vengeful relatives, of being stripped of their identities, of being subjected to treatments that felt like torture. They spoke of the loneliness, the despair, the slow, grinding loss of hope. Their accounts were a damning indictment of a system that had lost its way, a system that had begun with the promise of healing but had ended up inflicting its own unique and terrible form of madness on those it was meant to care for. The legacy of the Victorian asylum is a complex and troubling one. It is a reminder of how easily good intentions can be corrupted, of how systems designed to help can become instruments of control, of how fear and prejudice can shape public policy. The physical buildings, many of them, still stand today, empty and decaying, their windows broken, their corridors filled with graffiti and the debris of neglect. They have become ruins, haunted places that draw urban explorers and ghost hunters, their dark history lending them an air of Gothic romance. But the true haunting is not of ghosts, but of memory. The memory of the thousands upon thousands of people who lived and died within those walls, their lives reduced to a case file, a number, a footnote in a medical journal. Their stories are the real legacy, a reminder that the line between sanity and madness, between freedom and confinement, can be terrifyingly thin, and that the most dangerous place of all can sometimes be the one that is built with the best of intentions. The turning of the seasons within the asylum walls was marked not by the changing color of leaves or the scent of blossoms on the air, but by subtle shifts in the quality of light and the temperature of the long stone corridors. In the winter, the cold would seep through the thick walls, settling into the bones of the inmates who huddled on wooden benches, their thin clothing offering little protection against the damp chill. The attendants would stoke the coal-fired stoves in the common rooms, but the heat never seemed to reach the far corners, never seemed to penetrate the layers of wool, and felt that the patients wrapped around themselves. Breath would mist in the air, and fingers would turn white and stiff, and the cough that began in one corner of a dormitory would spread slowly, inexorably, through the entire ward, a low, rattling chorus that accompanied the long, dark months. In the spring, the airing courts would be opened more frequently, and the inmates would be led out in their shuffling lines to walk the paved perimeters. The sky above the high walls would be a pale, washed blue, and a thin, tentative sun would cast weak shadows on the ground. The patients would walk, their heads down, their feet tracing the same worn path they had walked 1,000 times before. Some would pause to look up at the sky, their faces registering a flicker of something, a memory of a world where the sky was not just a rectangle of light between high walls. A few would bend to touch a blade of grass pushing up between the paving stones, a tiny, defiant spear of green in the gray, sterile space. The attendants would watch, their eyes scanning for any sign of trouble, any deviation from the slow, monotonous circuit. The airing court was not a place of freedom, but a different kind of cell, one open to the sky but still bound by walls. The summer brought its own miseries. The wards would become stifling, the air thick and heavy, trapped by the same thick walls that held in the winter's cold. The smells would intensify, the carbolic soap unable to mask the underlying odors of sweat, of unwashed bodies, of the latrines that were never quite clean enough. Flies would buzz against the high windows, a constant, irritating drone. Tempers would fray, both among the patients and the attendants. Fights would break out more frequently, sudden, explosive bursts of violence that would be met with swift, harsh restraint. The padded cells would be occupied more often, their thick walls containing the screams and the pounding of fists that would go on for hours, until the occupant was finally exhausted into silence. The daily routine was a liturgy of small, repetitive acts. The waking bell, the cold wash, the thin breakfast, the long morning of labor or idleness, the midday meal, the afternoon of pacing or staring, the evening meal, the slow, shuffling procession back to the dormitories, the locking of the doors, the long night. It was a rhythm that existed outside of time, a cycle that repeated itself endlessly, with no progression, no change, no hope of an ending. The inmates learned to live within this rhythm, to find small comforts within its rigid structure. A particular spot in the day room where the afternoon sun fell warmest. A particular attendant who might slip them an extra piece of bread. A particular dream that recurred night after night, a brief escape into a world that existed only in the mind. For those who worked in the asylum, the rhythm was different, but no less consuming. The attendants, the nurses, the doctors, they too were shaped by the institution. They learned to see the patients not as individuals, but as types. The violent one, the mute one, the one who cried all the time, the one who thought he was Napoleon. They developed a professional detachment, a way of interacting with the inmates that was efficient but emotionally distant. They followed the rules, administered the treatments, recorded the observations. They went home at the end of their shifts to their own lives, their own families, carrying with them the faint, lingering smell of the asylum and the knowledge buried deep of the world they had left behind the locked doors. The doctors, the alienists, were the architects of this world. They were men of science, or so they believed, armed with thick textbooks and a confident certainty in their own methods. They walked the wards with an air of authority, their white coats a symbol of their status. They would pause by a patient's bed, ask a few perfunctory questions, scribble a note in a chart. They would prescribe the treatments, the cold baths, the sedatives, the restraints, with the same clinical detachment a surgeon might bring to an operation. They believed they were helping, that their methods, however harsh, were necessary to bring order to the chaos of the mad mind. They did not see the fear in the patient's eyes, or if they did, they interpreted it as a symptom, further proof of the illness they were striving to cure. The families of the patients occupied a strange peripheral space. Some visited regularly, bringing small gifts, sitting with their committed relative in the visitor's room. Their conversations stilted and awkward, filled with unspoken sorrow and guilt. Others never came, their relatives simply erased from their lives, a shameful secret to be forgotten. A few fought to get their family members released, hiring lawyers, writing letters to the commissioners, challenging the diagnosis and the commitment. These battles were rarely successful. The asylum had a powerful inertia, a tendency to hold onto its inmates long after any reason for their confinement had passed. The diagnosis, once made, was a permanent stain, a label that could not be easily removed. The stories of the individuals within the walls are largely lost to history, reduced to a few lines in a dusty admission register. A woman, age 34, admitted for puerperal mania after the death of her newborn child. A man, age 58, admitted for senile dementia, his occupation listed as laborer, his next of kin unknown. A teenager, age 16, admitted for moral insanity after being caught stealing from her employer. These sparse entries are all that remain of lives that were once full, complex, and real. They were mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, people who had loved and lost, who had hoped and feared, who had made mistakes and suffered tragedies. And then they were brought to the asylum, and the world outside simply went on without them. There were, of course, moments of unexpected grace within the walls. A patient who had been mute for years would suddenly speak a single, coherent sentence, startling an attendant. A violent patient would calm in the presence of a particular nurse, responding to a gentleness that others did not offer. A patient would create something, a drawing on a scrap of paper, a small figure carved from a piece of soap, a few lines of poetry muttered in the dark, a tiny, fragile testament to the person still alive within the broken mind. These moments were rare, and they were often fleeting. The system was not designed to nurture them, to build upon them. They were anomalies, small sparks of light in the overwhelming darkness, quickly extinguished by the relentless, grinding routine of institutional life. The deaths, when they came, were handled with the same bureaucratic efficiency as everything else. A patient would be found dead in their bed in the morning, or would collapse in the airing court, or would simply stop eating and fade away over the course of weeks. The doctor would be summoned, the death would be certified, the cause listed as exhaustion from mania or senile decay, or simply natural causes. The body would be removed to the asylum's mortuary, and then, a day or two later, it would be buried in the asylum cemetery. The grave would be marked with a simple wooden cross, or more often with a small, numbered stone. No mourners would gather. No words would be spoken. The patient would be forgotten, their existence reduced to a number in a ledger, a statistic in an annual report. The space on the ward would be filled within a week by another body, another lost soul from the endless, incoming tide of the unwanted. The night shift in the asylum had a quality all its own. The corridors, lit by dim gaslights that hissed and flickered, would stretch away into shadowy infinity. The sounds of the day, the shuffling feet, the muttering voices, the clang of doors, would be replaced by the sounds of the night, the deep, rhythmic breathing of the dormitories, the occasional cry or moan, the soft pad of the night attendant's footsteps. The night attendant, alone on a ward of 50 or 60 sleeping souls, would carry a lantern and make his rounds, peering into each face, checking for breath, for signs of life. It was a lonely, eerie vigil, a walk through a landscape of the unconscious, where every shadow seemed to move and every sound seemed to carry a hidden meaning. The hours would pass slowly, marked only by the striking of a distant clock, the changing of the guard at the main gate, the slow, imperceptible lightening of the sky beyond the barred windows that signaled the approach of another dawn. For the patients, the night was a time of vulnerability, a time when the guards of consciousness were down and the demons of the mind could roam free. Nightmares were common, vivid, and terrifying, sending sleepers bolt upright with a scream caught in their throats. The sedatives, the chloral hydrate, and the opiates would sometimes induce a heavy, dreamless stupor, but more often they would create a strange twilight state, a half-sleep filled with fragmented, disturbing images. The padded cells at night would contain not just the violently disturbed, but those for whom sleep itself was an enemy, those whose own minds had become a torture chamber from which there was no escape. The asylum at night was a place of profound isolation, where each person, patient and attendant alike, was alone with their own thoughts, separated by the thin walls of their individual consciousness. The day shift would arrive with the dawn, a fresh set of faces, a new batch of clean uniforms. The night attendant would give his report, a brief, clinical summary of the night's events. Number 27 was restless, cried out several times. Number 34 had a seizure at 3 a.m., is resting now. Number 12 tried to get out of bed, was restrained. The night would be filed away, its terrors and its quiet moments reduced to a few lines of text. The day would begin its own slow, measured progress, the same routine, the same faces, the same smells, the same sounds. And somewhere in the city beyond the walls, the world would be waking up. The carts would be rattling over the cobblestones. The factory whistles would be blowing. The children would be running to school. But within the asylum, time was different. It was a circle, not a line, a loop that repeated endlessly, with no beginning and no end, a perpetual present from which there was no escape. The story of Khutulun, the undefeated warrior princess of the Mongol steppe, is one that echoes across the centuries, a reminder that the past is not always a place of quiet submission and rigid roles. Her life, lived in the saddle and on the battlefield, was a direct challenge to the assumptions of her time and to ours. She was not a queen in a palace, but a commander on a horse, her authority earned not through inheritance or marriage, but through her own strength, skill, and unyielding will. The world she inhabited was one of constant motion, of vast horizons and sudden violence, a world where a person's worth was measured by what they could do, not by the circumstances of their birth or their gender. After her death, the stories of her exploits did not fade. They were carried by the oral traditions of the Mongol people, passed down from generation to generation around the campfires that dotted the steppe. Her name became a byword for female strength, for defiance against convention, for the idea that a woman could be a warrior and a leader, could be as fierce and as formidable as any man. The details of her life, the precise dates and locations, the names of her battles may have blurred over time, but the core of her story, the image of the undefeated wrestler, the trusted general, the daughter who almost ruled an empire, remained sharp and clear. In the 18th century, her story took a strange detour. A French writer named François Pétis de la Croix published a collection of tales he claimed to have translated from Persian, including a story about a princess named Turandot. This princess, like Khutulun, refused to marry, but her challenge was not wrestling, it was riddles. Suitors who failed to answer her 3 riddles were executed. The story was a hit, a dark and exotic fairy tale that captured the European imagination. It was adapted into plays and operas, most famously by the Italian composer Giacomo Puccini, whose opera Turandot, left unfinished at his death, became one of the most famous works in the repertoire. In Puccini's opera, the Princess Turandot is a figure of icy beauty and cruel power, a woman who has sworn vengeance on all men because of a wrong done to an ancestor. She is not a warrior, but a cold, unapproachable queen, her heart frozen by hatred. The story is one of love and sacrifice, of a prince who risks death to win her, and who finally, through his kiss, thaws her icy heart. It is a powerful and moving drama, but it bears almost no resemblance to the life of the real Khutulun. The wrestling has become riddles. The open steppe has become a gilded palace. The fierce, independent warrior has become a damaged, vengeful princess in need of a man's love to heal her. The transformation of Khutulun into Turandot is a fascinating example of how stories travel and change, how they are adapted to fit the cultural expectations of new audiences. The European audiences of the 18th and 19th centuries could not have imagined a woman like the real Khutulun. A woman who fought in battles, who commanded armies, who could throw any man who challenged her to the ground, was simply outside their frame of reference. They could understand a princess who was cold and cruel, who set impossible tasks for her suitors, because that fit within the familiar tropes of fairy tales and exotic romances. The real Khutulun, the flesh and blood woman of the steppe, was too strange, too challenging, too real. She had to be transformed into something more palatable, more understandable, more comfortable for the Western imagination. But the real Khutulun has not been entirely forgotten. In recent decades, there has been a growing movement to reclaim her story, to separate the historical woman from the fictional princess. Scholars have delved into the primary sources, the Persian chronicles of Rashid al-Din, the travelogues of Marco Polo, the few other scattered references, to piece together a more accurate picture of her life. They have placed her within the context of Mongol society, exploring the roles of women in that culture and the unique circumstances that allowed her to rise to such prominence. They have argued for her significance, not just as a curiosity, but as a genuine historical figure, a woman who wielded real power and influence in one of the most powerful empires the world has ever seen. In Mongolia today, she is celebrated as a national hero. Her image appears on statues and in paintings, a powerful woman on horseback, her bow in her hand, her hair streaming in the wind. Her story is taught in schools, a source of pride and inspiration for young Mongolians, especially young women. She represents a connection to a past when Mongolia was the center of the world, when its warriors conquered half of Eurasia, and when its culture produced figures of extraordinary strength and independence. She is a reminder that the values of the steppe, courage, loyalty, and skill, were not the sole province of men. Her story has also resonated far beyond Mongolia. In a world still grappling with issues of gender equality, with the question of women's roles in leadership, in the military, in public life, Khutulun offers a powerful example from the distant past. She demonstrates that the barriers we take for granted, the assumptions about what women can and cannot do, are not universal truths. They are specific to particular times and places. In a different time, in a different place, a woman could be a general, could be an undefeated wrestler, could be her father's chosen heir, could stand as an equal among the most powerful men in the world. Her life is a challenge, a question mark placed against the certainties of our own age. The image of her, standing in the wrestling ring, facing down yet another suitor, is a powerful one. It is an image of absolute self-possession, of a woman who knows her own strength and refuses to be defined by anyone else's expectations. She does not need a man to complete her, to give her value, to provide her with a place in the world. She has already made her own place through her own efforts. The men who came to challenge her came with the assumption that they would win, that a woman could not possibly defeat them. And one by one, they were proven wrong, thrown to the ground by a woman whose strength was not just physical but a matter of spirit. Her story does not have a neat, happy ending. She did not become Khan. She did not rule the empire. She married, for reasons that remain unclear, and she died, her death unremarked in the grand chronicles of the time. But her life was not a failure. It was a life lived fully, on her own terms, a life of courage and achievement that defied the limits of her world. And in defying those limits, she created a legacy that has outlasted the empires of her father and her cousins. A story that still has the power to inspire and to challenge, centuries after she took her last breath on the windswept grasslands of her homeland. The undefeated wrestler, the warrior princess, the woman who would be Khan, she remains a figure of enduring power, a reminder that the human spirit, in its fierce determination to be itself, can transcend the boundaries of time and culture and expectation. The medicine of the nomadic peoples was not a static collection of remedies, but a living, evolving system, constantly adapting to the changing circumstances of the migratory life. A healer who spent the summer on one part of the steppe might encounter plants and conditions that were unfamiliar, requiring them to learn from local elders, to experiment, to incorporate new knowledge into their existing framework. The following year, they might be hundreds of miles away, facing a different set of challenges, a different climate, a different array of ailments. This constant movement meant that nomadic medicine was inherently flexible, a collection of practices and beliefs that could be adjusted and modified as needed, without the constraints of a fixed, written doctrine. The knowledge was not hoarded by a single class of professionals. It was distributed throughout the community. The grandmother who knew which root to chew for a toothache, the herder who could recognize the early signs of a deadly infection in his favored horse, the mother who could calm a feverish child with a cool compress and a whispered lullaby, they were all part of the system. This diffusion of knowledge was a survival mechanism. In a small, mobile group, the loss of any single individual could be catastrophic. If only one person knew how to treat a broken bone, and that person died, the entire group's ability to survive a future injury would be compromised. By spreading the knowledge, by teaching it to the young, by making it a part of everyday life, the nomads ensured that their collective wisdom would survive, even in the face of loss. The spiritual dimension of healing was not a separate sphere, but an integral part of this holistic system. The shaman was not an alternative to the herbalist. The shaman was often the same person, or worked in close concert with those who had more specialized knowledge of plants and injuries. The physical and the spiritual were seen as two sides of the same coin. A wound might be treated with a poultice of yarrow, but it might also be accompanied by a prayer to the spirits of the land, an offering to the ancestors, a charm tied around the patient's wrist to ward off further harm. The healing of the body and the healing of the soul were one and the same process, a restoration of the individual to wholeness within the fabric of the community and the cosmos. The landscape itself was a participant in this process. The mountains, the rivers, the forests, the open grasslands, they were not just scenery, but living entities, inhabited by spirits that could be benevolent or malevolent, that could be called upon for help or appeased when angered. A healer might seek a particular plant not just for its chemical properties, but because it grew in a place that was spiritually potent, at the foot of a sacred mountain or beside a spring that was believed to have healing powers. The act of gathering the plant might be accompanied by rituals, by offerings of milk or tobacco, by words of respect spoken to the spirit of the place. The medicine was not just in the plant itself, but in the entire context of its gathering and preparation, a process that connected the patient to the land and its unseen powers. The tools of the healer were simple, made from the materials at hand. A leather pouch to hold dried herbs, a bone needle for suturing, a smooth, flat stone for grinding roots, a horn for bleeding, a piece of felt for a bandage, a drum for the shaman's journey. These objects were not just tools. They were extensions of the healer's knowledge and skill, imbued with their own kind of power through long use and association. A shaman's drum, in particular, was a sacred object, its skin painted with symbols, its frame adorned with bones and bells. It was the vehicle that carried the shaman into the spirit world, its rhythmic beat the sound of the journey itself. The patient, in this system, was not a passive recipient of treatment, but an active participant in their own healing. They were expected to follow the healer's instructions, to take the herbal teas, to rest, to participate in the rituals. Their family and community were also involved, offering support, praying for their recovery, adjusting their own routines to accommodate the needs of the sick person. Illness was a communal event, a disruption in the life of the group that required a communal response. The healing was not just about fixing a broken body, but about repairing the social and spiritual fabric that the illness had torn. The approach to death was similarly holistic. Death was not seen as a failure of medicine, but as a transition, a journey of the soul to the world of the ancestors. The dying person would be surrounded by family, by the community, by the shaman, who would help to guide the soul on its journey, to ensure that it did not become lost or angry, to appease any spirits that might try to hinder its passage. The rituals surrounding death were as important as those surrounding healing, a way of honoring the life that had been lived and ensuring that the departed would continue to play a role in the community from the other side. The dead were not gone. They were simply elsewhere, their spirits still present, still capable of influencing the lives of the living, still part of the ongoing story of the clan. The long, slow decline of traditional nomadic life, brought about by the expansion of settled civilizations, the imposition of borders, the collectivization of herds, and the pressure to adopt a more sedentary existence, has inevitably eroded the system of medicine. The old ways are no longer practiced by many. The knowledge is fading as the elders who held it pass away, and the young people move to cities, learn different skills, adopt different beliefs. The shamans are fewer, their rituals less frequent, their role in the community diminished. The vast, open steppe, the great teacher and provider, is itself changing, its grasslands shrinking, its wildlife disappearing, its ancient rhythms disrupted by climate change and industrial development. And yet, the system has not entirely vanished. In remote areas, in the felt tents of traditional herders, the old knowledge still lives. A grandmother still knows which root to chew for a toothache. A herder still knows how to treat a sick horse with a poultice of wild herbs. A shaman, somewhere, still beats his drum and journeys to the spirit world to seek a cure. And in the cities, there is a growing interest in this heritage, a desire to reclaim and preserve the wisdom of the ancestors. Ethnobotanists are documenting the traditional uses of plants. Cultural organizations are working to record the rituals and beliefs of the last remaining shamans. A new generation is beginning to see value in the old ways, not as a replacement for modern medicine, but as a complement to it, a source of wisdom about the relationship between health, community, and the natural world. The legacy of nomadic medicine is not just a collection of remedies, but a philosophy, a way of seeing the human being as part of a larger whole. It is a reminder that health is not just the absence of disease, but a state of balance, a harmony between the body, the mind, the spirit, the community, and the land. It is a challenge to the reductionist, mechanistic view of the body that dominates modern medicine, an invitation to consider the deeper, more complex dimensions of what it means to be alive and to be well. In a world increasingly disconnected from nature, increasingly fragmented by technology, increasingly burdened by stress and alienation, the old wisdom of the steppe speaks with a quiet, enduring power, a voice from a world we have lost, but might, in some small way, still learn from. The daily life of a medieval thief was not a constant state of action, but rather a long, slow suspension between moments of risk. The hours between one fumbled theft and the next were filled with a peculiar kind of waiting, a patience that was not a virtue but a necessity. He would find a place to observe, a shadowed archway, a corner of the marketplace where he could lean against a wall and appear to be nothing more than another piece of the urban decay. From this vantage, he would watch the flow of people, noting the way a merchant counted his day's earnings, the route a servant took to the well, the time at which a particular household barred its shutters. This was his work, the true labor of his profession, and it required a stillness that was almost meditative, a complete emptying of the self into the act of watching. The body, during these long hours of waiting, would become a source of its own quiet suffering. The cold would creep up from the stones, settling into the joints. The hunger would be a constant, low-level ache, a reminder of the emptiness within. The bladder would fill, demanding attention that could not always be safely given. He would shift his weight from one foot to the other, slowly, imperceptibly, so as not to draw attention. He would wrap his arms around himself, trying to conserve what little warmth his thin clothing could hold. He would think of nothing, or rather, he would think in a slow, circular way, his mind tracing the same paths over and over, the same calculations of risk and reward, the same memories of past successes and near escapes, the same dull, formless dread of a future that held only more of the same. When the moment finally came, it was often not a moment of high drama, but a simple, almost mundane opportunity. A baker turning his back for an instant, a woman setting down her basket to adjust her shoe, a drunkard slumping against a wall, his purse hanging loosely from his belt. The thief would move then, not with the fluid grace of a predator, but with a quick, furtive scuttle, his hand darting out, his fingers closing around the prize, his body already turning to melt back into the crowd from which he had emerged. The entire act would take only a second or two, a brief flicker of movement in the busy flow of the day, and then he would be gone, swallowed by the alleys and the press of bodies, his heart hammering in his chest, his hand clutching the warm, solid weight of his acquisition. The aftermath of a theft was a strange mixture of elation and terror. The immediate relief of having succeeded, of having secured another day's survival, would be quickly tempered by the cold, creeping fear of discovery. He would not stop running, not immediately. He would put as much distance as possible between himself and the scene of the crime, weaving through the maze of streets, ducking into doorways, doubling back on his own path. Only when he was certain he was not being followed would he allow himself to slow, to find a hidden corner where he could examine his prize. The coins, if there were coins, would be cold and hard in his palm. He would count them, his eyes flicking nervously over his shoulder, his mind already calculating what they would buy, where he could sleep, how long the respite would last. The places he slept were not homes, but merely shelters, temporary refuges from the elements and from the eyes of the watch. A haystack in a stable yard, the warmth of the decomposing hay a meager comfort against the night's chill. A corner of an abandoned building, its roof open to the sky, its floor littered with the debris of previous occupants. A space beneath a wooden staircase, just large enough to curl into a ball. The sounds of footsteps on the boards above a constant, unsettling presence. He would sleep lightly, if at all, his body tensed for flight, his ears attuned to every creak and rustle. Sleep, when it came, was a thin, fitful thing, a shallow descent into a world of fragmented dreams, from which he would start awake at the slightest sound, his heart racing, his hand reaching for a weapon that was not there. The relationships he formed with others on the margins were pragmatic and provisional. There was a woman he sometimes met in the shadow of the church, a fellow outcast who traded what she could for a few moments of shared warmth and the illusion of companionship. They would huddle together in a doorway, sharing a crust of bread and the thin comfort of another human presence. They did not speak of their pasts or of their hopes for the future. There was no future to speak of. There was only the present, the cold, the hunger, and the brief, fleeting respite they could offer each other. When the morning came, they would separate, going their own ways, their bond dissolved until the next night, the next moment of mutual need. There were other thieves, too, men who operated in the same territory, who knew the same alleys and the same fences. They were not friends, but rivals, and the relationship between them was a constant, low-level war of competition and mistrust. A successful theft could make a man a target, not just of the authorities, but of his own kind, who might try to rob him of his gains, or who might inform on him to the watch in exchange for a small reward. There was no honor in this world, no loyalty. There was only the law of the strongest, the quickest, the most ruthless. A man who showed weakness, who let his guard down for even a moment, would not last long. The seasons turned, and the nature of the struggle changed with them. In the spring, the rains would turn the streets to rivers of mud, making movement difficult and increasing the risk of discovery. The cold, damp air would seep into the bones, bringing coughs and fevers that could kill a man weakened by hunger. In the summer, the days were long and the nights were short, reducing the hours of darkness in which a thief could operate. The heat would be oppressive, and the smells of the town would become almost unbearable, a thick, rotting stench that clung to the skin and clothes. In the autumn, there was the hope of the harvest, of a brief abundance that might mean more opportunities for theft, more careless merchants, more full storehouses. But the autumn also brought the first hints of the coming winter, a chill in the air that was a reminder of the long, hard months ahead. And the winter was the great trial, the time when the margins grew thinnest and the ranks of the desperate thinned most drastically. The cold was a constant, grinding enemy, a force that sought to extinguish the spark of life itself. Food was scarcer, as the stores of the town were guarded more carefully. The nights were longer, and the cold seeped into every shelter, every corner, every scrap of clothing. A man could freeze to death in his sleep, his body stiffening into a permanent, peaceful repose. He could starve, his body consuming itself until there was nothing left. He could succumb to a simple illness, a cough that turned to pneumonia, a fever that burned through his weakened frame. The winter was a sieve, and only the strongest, the luckiest, or the most desperate made it through to the other side. And yet, for all its misery, there was a strange, stark beauty to this existence. The night sky, seen from a haystack or an abandoned building, was a vast, indifferent canopy, studded with stars that were cold and bright and impossibly distant. The silence of the town in the deepest part of the night was a profound, almost sacred thing, broken only by the most elemental sounds: the hoot of an owl, the bark of a distant dog, the soft whisper of the wind. In those moments, the thief was not a criminal, not an outcast, not a desperate man. He was simply a human being, alone under the stars, a small, fragile consciousness in the vast, unthinking universe. It was a moment of strange peace, a brief respite from the relentless pressure of survival, and it would last only until the first light of dawn began to seep over the horizon, bringing with it the return of the old, familiar fear. The Victorian asylum, for all its horrors, was also a place of profound and unexpected stillness. The long corridors, after the last bell had rung and the last door had been locked for the night, would fall into a silence that was almost palpable. The air, thick with the day's accumulated smells, would slowly settle, the dust motes hanging in the faint light that seeped through the high, barred windows. In the dormitories, the patients would lie in their narrow beds, their bodies still, their breath a soft, collective whisper. Some would be lost in the heavy, drugged sleep induced by chloral hydrate, their dreams a blank, featureless void. Others would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, their minds racing through the same worn grooves of thought, the same memories, the same fears, the same hopeless longing for a world they could no longer reach. The night nurse would make her rounds, her footsteps muffled by the long, worn runners on the corridor floors. She would carry a small lantern, its light a soft, yellow glow that pushed back the darkness just enough to see the faces of the sleeping patients. She would pause at each bed, listening for the sound of breath, watching for the rise and fall of a chest. She would note in her mind those who were restless, those who were still awake, those who seemed to be sleeping too deeply. Her job was not to heal, but to watch, to be a presence, a guardian against the chaos of the night. She was alone in the vast, sleeping institution, a solitary figure moving through a landscape of unconscious minds. In the padded cells, the silence was different, more oppressive. The thick quilting on the walls absorbed all sound, creating a dead, airless space where even one's own breath seemed muffled and distant. The patients confined there would often scream, not for any reason, but simply to fill the silence, to hear their own voice, to prove to themselves that they still existed. The sound would be swallowed by the padding, a faint, muffled cry that barely reached beyond the thick wooden door. The night nurse, passing by, might hear it, a distant, animal sound, and she would pause for a moment, her hand on the door before moving on. There was nothing she could do. The patient was where they were supposed to be. The system had deemed it so. The dreams of the asylum's inmates were a world unto themselves. For some, they were a blessed escape, a brief return to a time before the walls, to a life of freedom and family and love. They would walk again in green fields, would hold a child in their arms, would sit by a fire in a room that was their own. These dreams were cruel in their sweetness, offering a glimpse of a paradise that could never be regained. For others, the dreams were a continuation of their waking terrors, a nightmare landscape of pursuing figures, of suffocating darkness, of voices that whispered accusations and threats. They would wake with a scream, drenched in sweat, their hearts pounding against their ribs, only to find themselves in the same narrow bed, in the same locked ward, in the same unending night. The hours before dawn were the darkest and the coldest. The last of the night's coal would have burned out in the stoves, and the chill would seep back into the wards. The patients would stir, pulling their thin blankets tighter, their bodies curling into themselves for warmth. The first birds would begin to sing somewhere beyond the walls, a faint, tentative chorus that seemed to come from another world. The sky beyond the barred windows would begin to lighten, slowly, imperceptibly, a gradual shift from black to deep blue to the pale, washed-out gray of a winter dawn. Another day was coming, another round of the same routine, another slow, measured march through the hours until the night returned. The morning routine was a ritual of small, repetitive actions. The waking bell, a harsh, clanging sound that shattered the last remnants of sleep. The slow, shuffling procession to the washrooms. The cold water splashed on faces and hands. The lining up for breakfast. The thin porridge and weak tea consumed in silence at long, wooden tables. The assignment of tasks, the sorting of laundry, the scrubbing of floors, the mindless, repetitive labor that was meant to fill the hours. And then the long morning, the slow, patient waiting for the midday meal, for the brief respite of the airing court, for the endless afternoon that stretched out like a gray, featureless plain. The airing court, at least, offered a change of scene, however limited. The patients would be led out in their groups, their feet shuffling on the worn paving stones. They would walk the perimeter around and around, a slow, endless circuit. The sky above was a rectangle of pale light, and the walls that enclosed them were high and gray. Some would walk with their heads down, their eyes fixed on the ground. Others would look up, searching the sky for a cloud, a bird, any sign of the world beyond. A few would try to speak to each other. A few whispered words that would be quickly silenced by an attendant's sharp glance. The airing court was not a place of freedom, but it was a place of sky, and for a few moments that was enough. The seasons within the walls were marked by these small sensory details. The cold, damp chill of the stone corridors in winter. The thin, weak sunlight of spring, falling in pale rectangles on the worn floorboards. The oppressive heat of summer, the air thick and heavy, the flies buzzing against the windows. The golden light of autumn, slanting through the high windows, casting long shadows across the day room floor. The patients, for the most part, did not notice these changes. Their world had shrunk to the dimensions of the ward, and the turning of the seasons was just another distant event, like the comings and goings of the attendants, the occasional visit from a doctor, the rare, unexpected death of a fellow inmate. The deaths were a regular occurrence, and they were handled with the same efficient routine as everything else. A patient would be found dead in their bed in the morning, or would collapse in the airing court, or would simply stop eating and fade away. The doctor would be summoned, the death would be certified, and the body would be removed. The other patients would watch, their faces expressionless, their minds registering the event as just another part of the daily landscape. The dead patient's bed would be stripped and remade within hours, and by the next day, a new inmate would be sleeping in it. The individual was forgotten, replaced by another anonymous body, another case number, another soul to be processed by the great, indifferent machine. And yet, for all its grinding routine, its cold efficiency, its profound inhumanity, the asylum was also a place where small acts of kindness could still occur. An attendant might slip an extra piece of bread to a patient who was particularly hungry. A nurse might sit with a dying woman, holding her hand, speaking softly to her in the final hours. Two patients might form a silent, wordless bond, sitting together in the day room, their presence a comfort to each other in the long, empty afternoons. These moments were rare, and they were fragile, easily crushed by the weight of the system. But they happened because human beings, even in the most degraded of circumstances, will still reach out to each other, will still offer what comfort they can. It was a small, quiet rebellion, a refusal to be completely dehumanized, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. The story of Khutulun, when placed alongside the other narratives of this night, offers a strange and unexpected counterpoint. It is a story of freedom, of agency, of a life lived in the vast, open spaces of the world, in stark contrast to the confined, controlled existence of the medieval thief or the Victorian inmate. She rode where she wished, fought whom she chose, and stood as an equal among the most powerful men of her time. Her world was one of movement and choice, of horizons that stretched to infinity and battles that were fought under an open sky. It is a reminder that human experience is not a single, monolithic thing, but a vast and varied landscape, shaped by time and place and circumstance in ways that are almost unimaginable to us now. The bond between Khutulun and her father, Kaidu, was the anchor of her life. It was a relationship of deep trust and mutual respect, a partnership built on shared values and a common purpose. He saw in her the qualities he valued most, and he gave her the freedom to develop those qualities to their fullest. He did not try to confine her to the traditional roles of a woman. He did not try to marry her off for political advantage, not until the pressure became too great to ignore. He saw her as an individual, a person of unique and exceptional ability, and he treated her accordingly. In a world of rigid hierarchies and prescribed roles, their relationship was a small island of genuine connection, a bond that transcended the conventions of their time. The wrestling challenge, the vow that made her famous, was a brilliant and defiant act of self-definition. It was a way of taking control of her own destiny, of refusing to be a passive object of exchange in the political marketplace of her father's court. She turned the tables on the suitors, making them the ones who had to prove themselves, who had to earn the right to even be considered. And by making the challenge a public spectacle, she ensured that her refusal of the conventional path would be witnessed and remembered. The herd of horses she amassed from her defeated suitors was not just wealth. It was a tally of her victories, a visible, physical proof of her strength and her independence. Her presence on the battlefield was another form of this same defiance. She did not ride to war as a symbolic figurehead, but as a warrior, a commander whose skills were tested in the most brutal of arenas. She charged into battle, she fought hand to hand, she made tactical decisions that affected the lives of thousands. Her soldiers followed her not because of her lineage, but because she had proven herself capable of leading them, of winning victories, of bringing them home alive. Her gender, in the heat of battle, became irrelevant. There was only the fight, and she was a fighter, as skilled and as fearless as any man who rode beside her. The political machinations that prevented her from succeeding her father are a testament to the enduring power of tradition, even in a society that was as flexible and pragmatic as the Mongol Empire. The old men, the tribal elders, the powerful nobles, they could not see past the simple fact of her gender. They could not imagine a woman sitting on the throne, commanding their loyalty, leading them into battle. Their world was built on a certain set of assumptions, and Khutulun, for all her achievements, was a challenge to those assumptions that they could not accept. They preferred her brothers, even if they were less capable, less loyal, less worthy, because they fit the expected mold. Tradition, in the end, proved stronger than merit. The mystery surrounding her marriage and her death only adds to her legend. The historical records are silent on the details, leaving us to wonder. Did she marry for love or for political reasons, or as an act of loyalty to her father? Did she die in battle, or of illness, or by the hand of an assassin? The absence of answers creates a space for the imagination, a space where we can fill in the gaps with our own interpretations. The Khutulun of history is a figure of tantalizing incompleteness, a woman whose life we can trace in broad strokes, but whose inner world, whose private thoughts and feelings, remain forever out of reach. This silence is a part of her story, a reminder that the past is not a completed puzzle, but a collection of fragments, and that much of what was once real and vital has been lost forever. Her legacy, however, is not silent. It speaks in the statues that have been raised in her honor on the steppe, in the stories that are still told around campfires, in the growing recognition of her significance among historians and feminists around the world. She has become a symbol, an archetype of female strength and resistance, a figure who transcends the specific circumstances of her life to speak to universal themes of courage, independence, and the refusal to be limited by the expectations of others. In a world that still struggles with these issues, her story resonates with a power that is undiminished by the centuries. She was a woman who lived on her own terms, who fought her own battles, who stood undefeated. And in that, she remains an inspiration. The nomadic medicine of her people, the system of healing that would have been familiar to her, was a perfect expression of the world she inhabited. It was mobile, practical, and deeply spiritual, a way of understanding the human body and its relationship to the natural and supernatural worlds that was entirely different from the systems that would later develop in the settled civilizations of Europe and Asia. It was a medicine of the trail, of the felt tent, of the open sky, a knowledge that was carried in the minds of the people and adapted to the constant motion of their lives. The shaman, the central figure in this system, was a healer who operated on multiple levels. He or she was a doctor, a priest, a psychologist, a performer, a guide to the spirit world. The rituals of healing were dramatic, sensory experiences designed to engage the patient's mind and spirit as well as their body. The drumming, the chanting, the smoke, the dance, all worked together to create an altered state of consciousness in which the shaman could perceive the hidden causes of the illness and intervene on the patient's behalf. It was a form of medicine that recognized that human beings are not just physical machines, but complex entities with emotional, spiritual, and social dimensions that are all interconnected. The use of plants, the pharmacopoeia of the steppe, was based on generations of careful observation and experimentation. The healers knew which plants could stop bleeding, which could reduce fever, which could ease pain, which could induce sleep. They knew how to prepare them, when to gather them, how to combine them with other ingredients. This knowledge was not written down, but it was no less real for that. It was tested and refined by countless applications, passed down through families and communities, a living, evolving tradition that was as practical as it was profound. The treatment of injuries, the setting of bones, the suturing of wounds, the cauterization of infections was a field medicine, developed in a world where violence and accident were constant companions. The healers had to be able to act quickly, decisively with the materials at hand. A broken leg could be splinted with wood and leather. A deep cut could be stitched with horsehair. A wound that was turning bad could be burned clean with a heated iron. These were brutal methods, but they were effective, and they saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. The care of animals, the veterinary knowledge of the nomads, was an integral part of this system. The horse was not just a mode of transport, but a partner, a companion, a source of food and wealth and status. The health of the herd was inseparable from the health of the people. A herder who could not treat a sick horse was a herder who would not survive long on the steppe. The same knowledge that was applied to human patients was applied to animals. A seamless continuum of care that recognized the deep, symbiotic bond between the nomads and the creatures they lived among. The holistic nature of this system, its integration of the physical and the spiritual, the human and the animal, the individual and the community, is perhaps its most enduring legacy. It offers a different way of thinking about health, a way that is more connected, more contextual, more aware of the complex web of relationships in which every human life is embedded. It is a reminder that modern medicine, for all its extraordinary achievements, has also lost something, a sense of the whole person, a recognition of the spiritual and emotional dimensions of illness, a connection to the natural world that is the ultimate source of all healing. The medicine of the steppe, in its quiet, persistent way, continues to speak to this loss, offering a wisdom that is as old as the grasslands themselves, and as relevant as the next sunrise.